The crown that rested on her head that January morning in 1559 was not born of peace. It did not descend gently from the heavens, wrapped in divine favor or handed down through loving lineage. It had passed through fire, sharpened steel, and whispered betrayal. Elizabeth Tudor stood crowned, not because the world made room for her, but because she carved the space with silence, survival, and a gaze that never looked away, even from death. They called her the Virgin Queen. But before that, she had been called many things: bastard, heretic, traitor's daughter. Each name a wound, each wound a layer of skin hardened against sentiment. Even as the people cheered her procession from Westminster Hall to Abbey, cutting pieces of the blue carpet beneath her feet as relics, she knew they were not celebrating her ascent. They were rejoicing in their own reprieve, a monarch not foreign, not papist, not ruled by a man from across the sea. They were not welcoming Elizabeth, they were clinging to England. She understood that better than anyone, for no one had clung to England more desperately than she had. The wind on coronation morning was bitter. Though the sun shone, it was, in many ways, a false spring, as most victories are. The gold-embroidered train of her gown shimmered like molten daylight, but the weight was immense, not the fabric, nor the jewels, but the memory of every step that had brought her here. The steps into the tower when she thought she would never leave it. The steps away from her mother's ghost. The steps she had taken in silence while others screamed in the flames of Smithfield. A child of conflict, Elizabeth had never been handed anything. Not love, not faith, not safety, and certainly not power. It is said that her coronation was theatrical, near sacred in its symbolism. The anointing with oil at the shoulders, breast, palms, and crown, each gesture recalling the divine right of kings. But Elizabeth, keenly aware of irony, must have felt the absence of divine protection when her mother's head fell to the block. She knew too well how oil could be replaced with blood, how scripture could be wielded like a knife, how robes could become shrouds. She wore the crown, but she wore it like armor. In the days before the ceremony, she consulted her astrologer, Dr. D, not to read the stars, but to outmaneuver them. The pageantry, the trumpets, the orbs and scepters, they were not her inheritance. They were her camouflage. For she had learned that in England, to survive as a woman was not to fight openly, but to endure, to outthink, to outlast. And so, she smiled as she walked toward the throne. She did not look to heaven. She looked inward, into the quiet fire that had kept her alive when others perished, into the loneliness she had braided into discipline, into the memory of a letter, the ink smudged by tears, begging not to die. This, then, was not a coronation. It was a culmination. Not a reward for obedience, but the final stage in a lifelong act of defiance. Elizabeth Tudor did not receive the crown. She took it. She was born under a prophecy that betrayed her. The astrologers had promised a boy. The royal household had prepared for a son. The font was warmed, the names chosen, and the crimson cloths laid out for England's long-awaited heir. But what emerged was a girl, small, silent, and to her father, insufficient. They named her Elizabeth. But what lingered in the halls of Greenwich Palace was not celebration, but silence. Not the reverent kind, but the disappointed sort. She was not the prince they had prayed for. She was the second daughter of a king who did not believe daughters should reign. Her mother, Anne Boleyn, had once been Henry's obsession. For her, he broke from Rome, severed a kingdom, dissolved monasteries, and set fire to centuries of tradition. But passion is a sword with two edges, and Anne, clever, sharp-tongued, politically astute, would soon be accused of sins invented to justify her fall. Adultery, incest, treason. The charges were grotesque fabrications. but they were enough. Elizabeth was barely 3 years old when her mother knelt on the scaffold. The child was kept away from Tower Green, but the echo of the blade would stay with her all her life. Not in sound in absence, in the sudden vanishing of a mother who was no longer spoken of. No portrait, no letters, no lullabies, just a void, cold and unnamed. What does a child do with that kind of silence? She does not cry. She does not ask. She learns. Elizabeth learned quickly that her name could be erased, that one day you were princess and the next, bastard. The official wording was pitiless. She was now the Lady Elizabeth, a title stripped of all succession rights, no longer heir, no longer legitimate. The marriage that created her had been declared null, her existence reduced to an inconvenience of dynastic miscalculation. Her household fell into confusion. Her governess, Lady Bryan, wrote in near despair the child had outgrown all her clothes, lacked proper provisions, and worst of all, no one knew where she should sit. At the king's table, alone in her chamber, in Tudor England, where every placement denoted power, even a seat became a symbol of disgrace. But even in this fog of humiliation, Elizabeth began to fashion her first weapon: composure. She did not rage, she did not plead, she adapted. From a very young age, she cultivated an aura of unreadability, not out of calculation, but out of necessity. She understood, perhaps unconsciously, that any display of emotion could be turned against her. She would be watched, evaluated, judged not as a child, but as a threat. So she played the role they gave her, and she played it with unnerving poise. Her father rarely visited. He had moved on to his next queen, Jane Seymour, pale, pliant, everything Anne had not been. And when Jane gave him a son, Edward, the world rejoiced as if Elizabeth had never existed. She stood quietly at her half-brother's christening, a forgotten figure in the ceremony. Her former governess had been reassigned to the baby boy. Elizabeth was, once again, displaced, this time not by scandal, but by a boy's breath. Yet she did not collapse under the weight of neglect. She turned inward. She read. She studied. By the age of 4, she was reciting Latin phrases and mimicking courtly manners with terrifying accuracy. Her new tutor, Cat Ashley, recognized a mind far sharper than her years should allow and a heart already locked behind 1,000 silent observations. She learned not just languages, but how language was used as shield, as dagger, as spell. Double translation exercises forced her to master the precision of meaning, the duplicity of interpretation. She would translate from Latin into English, and back again, until every word bent to her will. This, too, was survival. To command words was to control perception, and perception, she already knew, meant life or death. Portraits of her from this period show a girl unnaturally composed, one finger resting on a book, eyes serene, unfathomable. Beside her, an open Bible, not just a sign of piety, but a declaration of inner order. Where others might find chaos, Elizabeth built ritual. Where others mourned loss, she buried it in learning. But inside, beneath the layers of obedience, beneath the gowns stitched for a daughter no longer wanted, there lived the phantom of a mother beheaded. The knowledge that blood had been shed not for her, but because of her. She did not speak of Anne Boleyn, but she did not forget her either. She wore silence like a cloak, knowledge like a dagger, and titles or their absence like passing weather. She was no longer daughter to a queen. She was daughter of no one. And that was how she began to become dangerous. By the time Elizabeth was 10, she had learned that silence could outlive scandal and that discipline was more reliable than affection. In a court where moods turned like the wind and heads rolled without warning, she began to understand that the sharpest defense was not strength, but structure. So she studied, not for praise, not for inheritance, but for control. Her days unfolded like clockwork. At sunrise, prayers, then Latin, then Greek, then French and Italian. Her lessons in logic and rhetoric were not taught to entertain curiosity, but to train restraint, while other girls embroidered. Elizabeth translated Cicero. While they daydreamed, she annotated Seneca. Her hands were steady, her face unreadable. Tutors noted her brilliance with awe and a trace of unease. Roger Ascham, her most celebrated teacher, would later confess that no apprehension could be quicker than hers, no comprehension more exact. She had the mind of a philosopher or a tactician. This was not simply education. This was armor. What others took as precocity was in fact rehearsal. She was learning how to speak without yielding, how to answer without revealing, how to submit outwardly while inside, resisting every pressure to soften or trust. Her letters from this time, many written in a calligraphy so fine it resembled metal engraving, show a girl who understood that words were instruments of power. One such letter, a New Year's gift for her father. Henry VIII was adorned in red and gold cloth, stitched with the royal cipher. But beneath the embroidery was Elizabeth's true offering, page after page of perfect prose in Latin, French and Italian, not a blot, not a crossed-out word. Precision was her flattery, perfection, her plea for recognition. In a world where she could not ask to be loved, she demonstrated she was indispensable. But no amount of brilliance could shield her from the world of men. When Henry died, Elizabeth was 13. Her half-brother Edward ascended the throne, a boy king surrounded by wolves in silk. Power did not pass smoothly, but seeped into the hands of whoever moved fastest. One of them was Thomas Seymour, the younger brother of the new Lord Protector. Where Edward was cerebral, Thomas was impulsive, handsome, restless, hungry, a man who could not distinguish desire from strategy, or perhaps saw them as one and the same. He had once courted Elizabeth's stepmother, Catherine Parr. When Henry died, Seymour married her in haste, not out of love, but position. For in marrying the Dowager Queen, he gained access not just to court, but to the young Elizabeth, who now lived under Catherine's roof. She was 14, he was 40. At first, he played the part of the charming stepfather. He entered her chambers unannounced at dawn, laughing, teasing. At times, he tickled her. At others, he slapped her backside. His presence became a routine intrusion, tolerated, even excused, under the guise of playful affection. Catherine, in the early days, found it amusing. She even joined in, once holding Elizabeth while Seymour cut her dress to ribbons in a mock flirtation. But beneath the laughter, something darker stirred. Elizabeth began to change. Her laughter became forced, her silences deeper. She rose earlier to dress before he could arrive. She avoided rooms where she might be alone. Yet when confronted, she denied discomfort. Because what language does a 14-year-old girl use to describe a danger that no one else acknowledges? Cat Ashley, her trusted governess, saw it clearly. She warned Seymour. He laughed. She warned Catherine. And Catherine, now pregnant, at last recognized what had been happening in plain sight. She confronted Elizabeth in private. The young girl said little, but her silence screamed. Elizabeth was sent away. It was the last time she saw her stepmother. Catherine Parr would die in childbirth not long after Delirious, betrayed, broken, and with her death, the thin veil of civility that shielded Seymour's ambitions fell. He now pursued Elizabeth directly. Rumors swirled that he had visited her in secret, that he intended to marry her and seize the throne, that he sought not a bride, but a crown in Tudor England. These were not whispers, they were death warrants. When the Lord Protector discovered his brother's schemes, Seymour was arrested. But so too was Elizabeth implicated. She was questioned for hours. Her servants were dragged away, interrogated, even threatened with torture. Cat Ashley broke under pressure and confessed everything the dawn visits: the torn gown, the touching, the tears. Elizabeth, however, never broke. She denied all wrongdoing. She denied all planning. Most of all, she denied Seymour the pleasure of having damaged her. But what the world saw as defiance was, in truth, a mask crafted from shame, confusion, and cold calculation. She knew she had been compromised, if not in body, then in perception. And perception, in a world like hers, was everything. One false impression, one rumor taken as truth, and she could be dead before her next birthday. In March of 1549, Seymour was executed on Tower Hill. His death was a grim punctuation mark in Elizabeth's adolescence, the severing of her last tether to whatever innocence remained. She was left with two things: survival and silence. From that point on, she wore caution like a second skin. She trusted almost no one. She kept her thoughts hidden, her emotions rehearsed. Her letters grew colder, more formal, her interactions measured. She had learned that to be wanted could mean to be used. That attention was a currency too easily turned into leverage. In private, she continued her studies. In public, she played the dutiful subject, and in the quiet corridors of Hatfield, she learned to watch not with fear, but with intent. She understood now that power did not always roar. Sometimes it whispered, sometimes it wore perfume, and sometimes it arrived at dawn with a smile and a hand on the door latch. Elizabeth never married, not because she could not love, but because she knew what love cost. The price of proximity to the throne was not glory, it was danger, and Elizabeth had come too close. In the spring of 1554, danger no longer wore a noble face or fine clothing. It came dressed in silence, sealed letters, and the creak of oars on the Thames. She was 20 years old, and they were taking her to the Tower. It began with whispers. A rebellion in the south, led by Sir Thomas Wyatt, seeking to prevent Queen Mary's marriage to Philip of Spain. The rebels invoked Elizabeth's name, not her orders, not her hand, just her presence, a Protestant figurehead in a realm now burning Catholics at the stake. Elizabeth did not reply to Wyatt, not in writing, not in words that could be twisted. But it didn't matter. Her name had been spoken, and in the world of power, implication was guilt. Mary summoned her to court. Elizabeth pleaded illness. The Queen's physicians found her well enough to travel. Her journey to London, 23 miles from Hatfield, took 11 days. Each hour, a quiet performance. I am not well, but I am obedient. I am not defiant, but I will not kneel. When she finally arrived at Whitehall, the rebellion had already failed. Wyatt was captured, tortured, executed. But Elizabeth was not safe. She was questioned, held, watched, until one morning. A decision was made. She was to be imprisoned in the Tower of London. The night before her transfer, she wrote the longest letter of her life to her half-sister, Queen Mary. It was not a plea for mercy. It was a plea for truth, each line meticulously crafted, every stroke measured. She began with certainty, her handwriting crisp, elegant, but as the letter dragged on, so did her exhaustion. The pen trembled, letters wavered, errors crept in, then were corrected. Then came a strange diagonal slash across the bottom of the page, not a flourish, but a desperate defense against forgery. No one would add false charges to her words. She left only space for one postscript. In Latin, I crave only one word with you. Mary never replied. And so, on a grey March morning, Elizabeth stepped into the rain, boarded the barge, and was rowed upriver in silence. The water was high. The stone steps at the tower slick with moss and grief. Every step she took echoed with ghosts Anne Boleyn's final walk. Lady Jane Grey's whispered prayers, the sobs of men who had never walked back out. Elizabeth did not cry. She did not beg, but she spoke not to her captors, but to history. "I come here no traitor," she said, loud enough for the guards to hear, but as true a subject as lives. And then the miracle, the soldiers fell to their knees. "God save your grace," they whispered, not because they believed she would be queen, but because they saw something regal in the way she bore fear without collapse. She was placed in the bell tower, in a room dark and stone-bound, and there she waited. Days turned to weeks. The bells tolled for others, but not for her. She read. She walked in circles. She listened for footsteps, wondering if they brought death. The past pressed in on her. Her mother, executed a few yards away. Her father, a king whose love was a blade. Her sister, now queen, wielding religion like a scythe. Outside the walls, the fires of Smithfield rose, burning Protestants alive, turning martyrs into ashes and fear into policy. Inside, Elizabeth fought illness, headaches, sickness, sleeplessness. But above all, she fought the one thing she had learned never to show panic. There were days she thought the guards would come for her at any hour. Other days, she thought they had forgotten her entirely. Both fates were terrifying. Then, on May 19th, the anniversary of her mother's execution, Sir Henry Bedingfield arrived with 100 men. Elizabeth believed she was about to die. She dressed in white. She prayed. She whispered the psalms she had memorized as a child. When Bedingfield entered, she did not flinch. But he had not come to escort her to the scaffold. He had come to move her to Woodstock Palace, a new prison in the countryside. The Queen lacked proof, and lacking proof, she could not yet kill her. Elizabeth was not free. At Woodstock, Bedingfield watched her every step. She could not walk alone. Letters were intercepted, gifts inspected, food tasted. Even her prayers were overheard. She began referring to Bedingfield, half in jest, as my jailer. But there was no jest in her eyes. A year passed. Mary grew sicker, but Elizabeth said nothing. Rumors swirled of phantom pregnancies, foreign alliances, burned bishops. But Elizabeth remained still, unmoving, like a chess piece on the edge of a board no one dared touch. She did not complain. She did not court sympathy. She became a mirror, reflecting nothing, inviting nothing, showing no edge. What had once been pain had now hardened into strategy. She wore plain gowns, attended mass when forced, smiled politely at those who once watched her suffer, and when allowed to return to Hatfield, she did so with the gait of someone who had survived, not through strength, but through invisibility. It was there, in the peace of her childhood home, that she read a translation of St. Basil's epistle, a work praising the virtue of the single life. It was a gift from her tutor, who knew too well what she had endured. The saint's argument was theological, but for Elizabeth, it was political. Celibacy meant freedom. No husband to control her, no foreign prince to use her, no man to claim her name or her crown. She would never allow another Seymour. Never again would she confuse attention for love. Never again would she mistake power for protection. Elizabeth had entered the tower a girl. She left it a survivor, and the girl who had once been called bastard would now wait in silence for the day the realm came back to her. The message arrived not with trumpets, but with breathless messengers riding through the brittle leaves of an English November, 10 days earlier. Queen Mary had died childless, worn, abandoned by hope and hated by her people. And now they had come to Hatfield to deliver the crown to her half-sister. Elizabeth stood beneath the branches of a great oak tree when the news was spoken aloud. It was not the words themselves that moved her, but the silence that followed. The kind of silence that gathers when destiny, long delayed, finally catches up. She did not weep. She did not cheer. She knelt in the cold earth and whispered words from the 118th Psalm. "This is the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes." But if her ascension was divine, it came with no guarantee of peace. England was broken, torn between old faith and new, between fear of foreign kings and hunger for national sovereignty, between memory and hope. And at the heart of this fracture stood a woman who had been called bastard, traitor, virgin, heretic, and now queen. The Spanish ambassador sent word to King Philip it was his intervention. He said that secured Elizabeth's crown. She owed him everything. Elizabeth did not answer. Later, he would write in fury that she acknowledges no authority, no guidance, no debt. He was right. She had survived too much to be anyone's puppet. On the 23rd of November, she rode into London. The people surged to see her. They cheered, but it was not just adoration, it was recognition. She had walked the same streets once as a prisoner, shackled not by chains but by suspicion. Now she moved freely, yet with the stillness of someone who had learned how quickly adoration curdles into accusation. Elizabeth consulted her astrologer not for superstition, but symbolism. The coronation would be held on January 15th, 1559. It would be a Sunday, a day of resurrection. She made her procession through Westminster in a robe lined with ermine, her hands unshaking. The abbey echoed with the voices of choir boys and bishops, but her gaze never wandered. This was not awe. It was calculation. Every step a ritual, every gesture a declaration. When the oil touched her shoulders, her breasts, her hands, her crown, it did not sanctify her. It sealed her. She was not becoming divine. She was becoming untouchable. 3 crowns were placed on her head. Not 1, 3. And with the last came a ring slipped onto her 4th finger. Not a wedding to a man, but to England itself. A mystical marriage, a union forged not in love, but in necessity. She was no man's wife, but she was the bride of a wounded nation. Elizabeth wore her learning like other queens wore pearls. In the first months of her reign, she answered ambassadors in Latin, French, or Italian, depending on who addressed her. She held her own counsel with the calm intensity of a scholar priestess. She negotiated like a chess master, never rushed, never trapped, always thinking 3 moves ahead. But more than anything, she remembered. She remembered the morning Seymour crept into her chamber. She remembered the tower's damp stone and the letter that bought her hours. She remembered the blood on the cobblestones at Smithfield. She remembered the look in Mary's eyes, both frightened and cruel, and memory was her weapon. Her portraits from this time show a woman beyond reach. Hair ablaze with red gold curls, gowns embroidered with eyes and ears, symbols of omniscience. In one, her hand rests on a globe. In another, she stands on a carpet of flowers, holding a book. The Virgin Queen, yes, but not chaste in the religious sense, chaste in sovereignty, untouched, unowned, unbent. It was not that she had no need for love, but she knew too well that love could be used, and that men, even those who claimed to serve, were too often architects of cages. She kept favorites, played them off each other, gave them smiles, but not trust. When they sought her hand, she offered policy. When they demanded decisions, she gave delay. She ruled with charm and distance, with mercy and spectacle. Never fully known, always just out of reach. She had become what she had always rehearsed to be, a symbol. But symbols are not safe. They bear weight. The fires had not stopped burning. Heretics still hung from gallows. England's enemies circled like wolves. and even within her own court, whispers persisted that a woman could not rule, that the memory of Henry VIII was too large, too virile, too masculine to be followed by a daughter born of scandal. So Elizabeth answered them not with proclamations, but with time. Year after year, she ruled. She weathered plots, plagues, invasions, storms. She outlasted popes and kings, counselors and suitors. She outlived the hatred of her enemies and the hope of her lovers. And through it all, she remembered. She remembered the little girl who had no seat at court, the teenager who flinched at footsteps in the hallway, the woman who knelt in the rain and refused to call herself traitor. She had become queen, but she had never stopped being a prisoner of her own survival. And in that lay her power. For what is a sovereign if not the one who holds her memory intact, who rules not by erasing pain, but by never letting it repeat? Elizabeth wore the crown, but it was her memory, precise, painful, unrelenting, that truly made her queen.